Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I'll be hanging out with you for the next hour on a Good Friday. Hopefully you are enjoying some time off work, relaxing. If you are stuck at work, well, hopefully it is manageable and you get some other time to relax and reflect at some point. We are going to be talking a bit about Jesus on Good Friday. I was trying to think during the week of what I'd do for the show, and I thought, look, on the one day, you know, in our spiritual wasteland, consumer capitalist society, the one day when they say, let's shut all the shops and have a time for spiritual reflection, you know, it feels weird to just then be talking about other things. It's like, well, you know, let's use this opportunity because we could certainly do with a bit of reflection on deeper matters, you know, as our society kind of has multiple intersecting crises and seems to be, you know, just hurtling along at a speed that nobody can sort of slow down or keep up with no real idea of where we're going or how we can shape this journey we're on. Though, you know, we need some time for reflection to stop and reflect and think about the deeper matters. And so I'm very grateful that we still do have a day like today when most of the shops are shut, you know, and we're forced out of our normal consumer capitalist treadmill into doing something else. And so today we're going to be reflecting on what it all means, this piece of cultural tradition that we're living out now on this long weekend that is Easter. It's a very old celebration and it's meant different things to different people over the years. And so we're going to investigate it a bit. I've got a couple of people I've interviewed. One is Pattel-Gray, who is a Bidjara woman and is a notable Aboriginal theologian. She talks about red ochre theology of kind of uncovering an Aboriginal understanding of God. And according to the internet, she also, I'm not sure if she's the first Aboriginal person in Australia to get a PhD at all or just the first from Sydney University. But anyway, a trailblazer in academia, and she's, still out there doing stuff, trying to build up the consciousness in the broader churches of like Aboriginal understandings of God and Aboriginal culture and what it has to contribute to this nation that we have. And so I chat to her about Easter and what it means for her. And then in the second half of the show, we'll talk to Dave Andrews, who is also a Brisbane-based theologian. He calls himself a christi-anarchist and has his own reflections on what it all means. And so that's what's coming up on the show. But maybe we'll start off having a chat with Anne.
I'm Professor Dr. Anne Pattel-Gray. I'm the head of the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
And one of the things you've written, you're one of many, I guess, Aboriginal theologians in Australia who are trying to contribute a different perspective to, Christian discourse in this country. And you've used a couple of terms in your own writing, black theology and red ochre theology. Can you tell us what you mean by these terms?
Yeah, sure. Look, black theology grew out of the 80s, and it basically was a theology that belonged to black peoples of the globes, and it was an expression of Aboriginal theology also in Australia. It also drew heavily on African American theologians and biblical scholars as well as African, and drew heavily upon two-third world theology as well as an expression of what it meant to be oppressed minorities in the world, and how we were interpreting the Gospels, and basically identifying how Jesus was a part of our liberation in the sense of how we defined ourselves as followers of Jesus and what that means for us. The second part of it is also looking at it from a minority perspective of oppressed peoples and how Christ is in the midst of our suffering. Red ochre theology is born out of my own context, drawing heavily upon my cultural ancestral narratives, as well as my cosmology and epistemologies of my people. Trying to define, I suppose, for ourselves an authentic Aboriginal theology that expresses our cultural reality and what it means to be Indigenous in this country.
Yeah, I'm interested in Aboriginal theology, and I guess there's two different things that you've brought out there with the black theology and red ochre theology, and one is that when you are oppressed and occupied person like Jesus was at the time, and poor like so many of the people around him were, you do understand the Bible in a different way to people who are sort of rich and the occupiers, right? They just read it in a totally different frame. But I guess the other thing that's there is also mixing traditional Aboriginal beliefs, what some would call the dreaming and things like that, in with a kind of Christian understanding. Are both of these part of like an Aboriginal theology?
Oh, very much so. Every race and every culture needs to contextualise their theology to their context and cultural expression. And literally that's what we're doing, is for Aboriginal people relating to the Bible and the stories of Jesus and Christ from our context and making it relevant within this country, and giving a deeper meaning and understanding of what it means to develop our own theology.
And in a lot of ways, at the moment in the world, the number of people going to church in the sort of white Western world is declining, but both the population growth and also the growth of churches in the majority world, the poorer black or people of colour world, is growing. And I think probably the majority of global Christianity now happens in these sort of developing world nations with black people in the churches. And do you think that's reflected in the general understanding of Christianity and in the way that theology is written and interpreted?
Oh gosh, no, of course not. The Bible that came here was so westernised and so contextualised to a Western culture that in order to be Christian, you had to be Western. You had to take on complete value systems and ideology of the West, and that's not what the Christianity is about. Christianity speaks into all cultures and is expressed through cultural expressions. And so what is happening is around the globe is the minority peoples or people of colour have taken the Christian faith within their context, and for Indigenous people, we've indigenised it in our cultural expressions and given relevance, and in other contexts they've done the same. And people of colour I suppose we're a large group of population around the globe, and where Christianity is dying within the mainstream, in our context in Australia, amongst Western people, it is growing exponentially amongst people of colour. And as you see also, we have other faiths within Australia as well that is growing and broadening here and taking root here in this country as well. So, I think it speaks more about how we see Christianity as a prophetic voice for justice and challenging those institutions that are encapsulated with racism to look at themselves and to practice, being a follower of Jesus who called out all manner of oppressions with governments and religious institutions, and who favoured the poor and ate with the sinners, and was seen amongst the oppressed and the downtrodden and the marginalised. And that's what Jesus says, I've come for them, the least, in order that they can be the first. So there's a lot we can learn from, Christianity, in the sense of challenging those oppressive institutions that founded this country, and particularly in Australia, colonised and used Christianity as a vehicle and as a tool to oppress and to justify all manner of sins, because, Christianity was baptised by empire.
Yeah, you've been very critical of the history of churches in Australia, in their role in colonisation in this continent. And I guess right now, in a different context, we're seeing, religion used to justify a very shocking war and act of violence in the so-called Holy Land. How do you reconcile this kind of legacy of the church and religion with your own faith?
Look, the first thing about, Christianity, it talks about love, God's love. And what we see is when one's faith is used as a weapon of power to subjugate and to take from another group of people what is rightfully theirs. Why is it that it's so difficult to live in peace and to respect one another? That's what's so sad. Are we so driven by our greed to possess, to own, and to have great wealth, that we have to oppress another in order to have power? I mean, that's not what Christianity is about. And it's sad to see these wars being justified in this manner when so many innocent people are dying. And if we hold true to our faith and we believe in a loving Creator that created us all, then why is it so hard for us to sit down and to define what we need to define to have everlasting peace?
Well, let's talk about Easter. It is the Easter weekend, one of the significant parts of the Christian calendar. What does Easter mean for you personally?
Look, Good Friday is probably the most important aspect, or the important story of the Easter series. When Jesus, being forced to carry the cross, he'd been found guilty of nothing more than being the Son of God. And, his criticism of government and of the religious institution of the day is what led him to be crucified. And that's an indictment of, human structures and powers that we could not see the relevance, nor would we be open. That the relevance of Jesus' crucifixion is such an important story for us to tell. It's about the suffering, the persecution, and the rejection of the Son of God. And, you know, so many Christians want to rush over that story and come to the resurrection, you know. But we need to sit in this space to think about how we do that daily to different groups of people, how we persecute, how we reject, and how we oppress, you know, and what we're doing to other people in the name of our faith, you know, which is absolutely criminal and devastating to be using one's faith to justify that kind of rejection and persecution of another human being. And it's good for us to sit in this space. You know, Aboriginal people, we can sit in this space because we understand the persecution, we understand the rejection, we understand the oppression and crucifixion of Jesus on this day, and how innocence can be overlooked because they didn't understand. But no, it's an important day. Easter is an important time. How we have commercialised it is probably a little bit more disgusting. But we've lost the relevance of what Easter's about. We're all off having a good old holiday and buying Easter eggs, you know. Shops are making a lot of money out of it. Easter's just about being with one another and appreciating, and what it means to atone for our own sins during this time is a really important message as well.
You sort of answered it, but do you think that reading that Easter story through Aboriginal eyes adds extra layers of understanding that other people seeing that story might miss?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you know, when you're an oppressed minority, you bring a different interpretation to the biblical chapters, and particularly at Easter. And as an oppressed minority who continue to suffer horrific racism within Australia and marginalisation and persecution, we relate very well to this and bring our cultural lens of understanding of ceremony, you know, because this is a significant ceremony, a ceremonial time for Christians around the globe and for Aboriginal people, because we understand this story deeply and we carry the cross. That cross that Jesus was meant to carry, we've been carrying it for colonial sin since colonisation. So we understand the symbolism of the cross and what the message that comes with that as well.
So today there's a lot of people with a day off work, maybe they're at home listening to this, and for a lot of people they wouldn't think that the Easter story has much relevance. But I guess, how do you think that people, whether they're believers or not, should relate to this occasion as we get, you know, a long weekend and this, you know, chocolate and hot cross buns and all of that?
Look, you know, it's a time for family. It's a time to reflect. It's a time to atone, to think of the things that we did wrong but could have done better, the harsh words that we may have said to someone out of stress. You know, in this day and age, so many people, we are so short of time. We have so many demands upon our life. And today and this Easter break is a good time for us to stop and take a breath and appreciate the love of family, the opportunity to tell our loved ones that we love them, but also to express our gratefulness for what we do have in this time. And, you know, a lot of Australians are struggling at the moment with economic pressures and trying to put food on the table. Just give you blessings that, you know, the people that matter are able to be with you in one form or another, and that, you know, together we share laughter and love, These are the important things that we need to remember at this time. It doesn't matter about how many eggs you've got and about whether you can put this mountainous of food on the table. What is important is family and friends and having this time together and being grateful for the blessings that have been given to you and appreciating what you have.
All right, thanks very much, Anne.
Thank you so much, Andy.
We were speaking with Anne Pattel-Gray, who one of her specialty subjects is black theology, and by that it's I guess understanding what the people of colour around the world, what they contribute to understanding of things divine and, well, gospel music. Of course, amazing contribution that black Africans brought to North America to work as slaves and trying to find their kind of their place, their home, their freedom, and these things. That the black gospel music tradition was a way that they tried to do that, and what amazing legacy it is. And yes, Anne has our own, I guess, Australian Indigenous understanding of God as well, which is one which I suppose doesn't get told enough. And most people, they still, when they would talk about religion or something like that, they would just see it as something that's mostly white, and it's our own kind of ingrained thinking that does that. But yeah, there's a broad range, and through history as well, there's been a broad range, although of course the nature of battles for power and influence in the end means some voices are heard more than others. But that's a continuing journey, I guess, a continuing journey of how we tell stories, how we tell cultural stories and things like that. In the second half of the show now, we're going to be speaking with Dave Andrews, who is another Brisbane-based theologian, and Dave spent a lot of time studying and trying to work out his own theology of how the message of the Bible and other religions as well, which he tries to work with, as well how they make for a way that we can all make a better world together.
My name's Dave Andrews. I live in West End, part of a community network here called the Waiters Union, and we're engaged with developing community with marginalised people in the neighbourhood.
And you're also quite a theologian, a teacher and an author of many books about Christianity and related things. So I assume you've thought quite a bit about the Easter story that we are commemorating on this weekend and what relevance it has to our society. I wonder, for you personally, what is the significance of the Easter story?
So I think there are two or three things about the story of Easter that are important for me. One is that in Jesus we have a good man who comes into our world, and instead of being welcomed by the authorities, he's actually condemned by the authorities because he exposes their hypocrisy and corruption and exploitation. And so one of the things that the story of Easter does is it unmasks the powers that be. And that's always been a very powerful kind of reflection for me on Easter, that it's not a kind of benign story of bunny rabbits. It's actually a profound unmasking of the pretensions of the powers that be that claim to be on the side of good, on the side of God. And when a good man comes who actually represents what many people believe is God, he is not welcomed. He's actually crucified. And so the whole of the pretensions of the powers that they're on the right side of history is exposed. Another thing I think that really is powerful for me is that there is to see in Jesus' response to this crucifixion not a call for revenge or retaliation, but for forgiveness. And he seems to be embodying a way of responding to evil that absorbs pain, embraces rage, but stops the cycle of violence by allowing that to be embedded as the spear was in his side, and to respond to that with forgiveness. And to me, that is incredible. It's an incredible example of an alternative way of engaging evil in our world that doesn't respond to evil with evil, but responds to evil with good, and a resolute, committed, compassionate good. And I find that particularly very, very inspiring as a model. And in fact, many of our great advocates for justice in the world, whether it's Gandhi or whether it's Martin Luther King or whether it's Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu, these are all people that have been inspired by that example of Jesus at Easter.
So the story of the, supposedly all-powerful God and the, charismatic, successful human being crucified on a cross and seeming to do it willingly rather than respond in violence. He said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. It was certainly an unexpected story then, and even with 2,000 years of this story, existing in our culture, it's still quite an unusual story now. What do you think those elements of the story that you talk about of non-violence and of forgiveness, what message do they have for us today?
Well, it's very interesting you should ask that, Andy, because right at this time, in our neighbourhood, there's a gathering of people at the local Uniting Church who go on a Good Friday on a walk around our neighbourhood, and they read the story about the crucifixion of Jesus, and they try to identify places where in our own culture today we are betraying what we know intuitively to be right and good, and we are fighting against that which is just, and we are committing acts of injustice regardless of the rhetoric that we might utter. And so we go around the neighbourhood and try to identify places where serious injustice has been committed, or what Christians would say where Christ is being crucified afresh in the sufferings of innocent people. So we go to a local park where Indigenous people meet, as we remember the way that Indigenous people still are being crucified. And because of Christ's identification with Indigenous people and their struggle, we realise Christ is being crucified afresh. We go to the local police station where we realise many people have been unjustly incarcerated and punished for crimes they did not commit. And we reflect on that. We go to the local women's support centre, and we particularly think of the violence against women in our culture, where one person a week is actually killed by an intimate partner, and in that we just sense a linking of the story of Jesus, who stood by the marginalised and disadvantaged and was crucified for his radical identification with them and their struggle. And we try to reflect on where that is still being enacted today in our own context, in our own neighbourhood, here and now.
I'm also interested in the other characters in the Good Friday story and the the role that they play in this kind of archetype. You have people like Judas, who would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. You know, you have Pilate, the leader, who wants to wash his hands of the whole thing and claim no responsibility. And then you have the angry mob who go from, you know, cheering on Jesus one week to calling for his blood the next week. What do you think these parts of the story have to say to us?
Oh, absolutely. I think it wouldn't be too difficult to identify authority figures like Pilate, who washed their hands of the serious issues of injustice in our culture, and maybe receive reports about that and file the reports, but don't actually act on the issues they're confronted with that they need to attend. We have religious leaders who actually support injustice in our society, because in return for that they get favours of tax deduction and government funding for schools or for agencies or organisations that they run. We have the crowd, which represents people at large, who may be generally indifferent, who don't particularly care, but, you know, are interested in the spectacle and get excited about that, but don't really care about the consequences of their support for those spectacles at the expense of those that are most innocent. I think for people like you and I, Andy, who are committed to struggling for justice, I mean, Barabbas is an interesting example, because his name was actually Jesus Barabbas. So the choice people had that day was, do they support Jesus Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth? And they supported Jesus Barabbas because he was committed to working for change, but to work for change violently, which helped people ventilate their rage, but didn't actually break the cycle of violence. And often that's a temptation for people like you and I to go down that track. It's very hard to choose to reject that model of change and opt for the model of Jesus, which is non-violent, and that it seems, at least in the short term, is a complete and utter failure. It's only in the long term we see that commitment to non-violence actually begins to have an accumulative effect on change and can bring change quite profoundly.
Now, these Christian stories can mean a lot of different things to different people, and Christianity has been in the news in the last couple of weeks in Australia again, with some people whose very strongly held beliefs, I guess, are leading them towards hostility to others. What do you think those elements of, you know, the self-sacrifice and the forgiveness in this story, what lesson do they have for those, you know, full of passionate belief that can lead to a hostility to others?
Well, I think what's really interesting in this story is that the religious leaders are actually condemned because of their support for the status quo, and there's a clear affirmation of the importance to stand up for what is true and right and good, but the challenge is to choose to find creative, constructive, non-reactive, non-violent ways of doing that, so that we don't destroy the very thing that we're trying to create. After all violent revolutions betray the very people that they advocate for. And if we're going to be committed for change constructively, I think one of the lessons for us to learn is to find a way of following that radical, non-violent example of Jesus from Nazareth, rather than the violent path of Jesus Barabbas.
Now, one of the funny things about delving into this story in any way is that even though Easter is everywhere at the moment, you know, you go into a supermarket, you're confronted by walls of like Easter eggs, Easter bunnies, hot cross buns, all kinds of plastic crap, we're not engaging with it at all. And I guess it's so funny, isn't it, that this story that contains not just the kind of political intrigue of leaders colluding and betrayers and courts and prisons, but also a lot of blood and gore of this capital punishment, that this story exists, and yet, the name is everywhere and the substance of it seems to be nowhere.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that the whole of the fertility cult and the images of that, in the egg and the rabbit and so on, are actually in our Western tradition actually precede the coming of the Easter story to our cultures, and so that's really an intrinsic part of our kind of cultural tradition, that whole fertility cult at this time of spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and so it's not surprising that is a really strong part of people's experience of Easter. And it was the attempt of the Christians who came into our culture to take that traditional culture about spring and fertility and the coming of life and the coming of new life, to try to bring the Easter story and celebrate it at this particular time of the year, because one of the aspects of the Easter story is not just the death of Christ, but the fact that we believe he actually rose from the dead. And so they wanted to kind of link this great, wonderful alternative story of the dying and rising of Jesus to a culture that celebrates new life, the coming of spring and so on. So there's always been those two things that sit side by side rather uneasily, and we still have that reality today in our culture.
So I think we can say that many of our listeners wouldn't describe themselves as followers of Jesus in any kind of way, but they're probably getting a day off work today, and over the weekend they'll almost certainly eat some Easter eggs or hot cross buns and in some way engage with this story that's part of our culture of the Easter story. I guess, what do you think is a good way for people in our culture to engage with this story over the weekend?
I think probably most people won't engage with the story very meaningfully. And so I think it's great that there's people like yourself talking to people about the story and raising some issues for people to consider. And maybe there'll be other voices like yours where people will share some of the significance of the original story, and I would encourage people to think about that, not just dismiss it as religion that might get in the way of the party, but they would consider this story as being one of the most significant stories in history that was so of such importance. It actually was it changed history. And I just encourage anybody that's listening to this little interview that they would just take a little time out to think, how significant was that story? Why do people still talk about it after 2,000 years? What is there that I can actually learn from this that might be important for me?
All right. Thanks very much, Dave.
You're welcome. Have a good day, Andy.
That is Dave Andrews there, talking about the Easter story. Hope you have enjoyed our little Good Friday show today, and I hope you do enjoy a long weekend. We don't get that many of them, and as Anne said earlier on, we're often so pressed for time, and so stressed by all the demands on our attention and our limited capacity in this world. There's so many things that needs to be done that this kind of time off is very valuable, and of course, worth hanging out with people that we love, and also reflecting on ourselves, reflecting on this story and ourselves. And I guess it's a story about suffering as well, and we all suffer in some ways, but also we're often involved in the suffering of others, and those are things worth reflecting on as well, and think about how we live and how our society lives and how we might want to change it, repent, as they say, to turn around and try a different way. And there's certainly better ways are possible than the way that we're living now, and so it's good to have a chance to reflect, and also on the cycles of death and rebirth, I guess, as well, that are part of this story as well. So thanks for coming along for the ride on our little detour into spiritual matters on the paradigm shift today. And I'll be back next week, of course. I'm talking to more people about trying to make a better world. See you next week.